Good evening, everyone, and delighted to welcome you to our discussion with a slightly odd title, Bots of War, on regulations and safeguards for cybersecurity. We have an outstanding panel of experts and practitioners, so I'm not going to come between them and the subject. Let me just go right into it. What we're going to do is give each of our 5 panelists an opportunity to say in a few minutes what they think is most important about this issue. We'll then have a discussion amongst ourselves and open it up to all of you. While we're talking, your dinners will be served, I understand. So if you could try and minimize the clatter of cutlery, that will be greatly appreciated. But otherwise, let me start with Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Special Representative. He headed the Global Commission on Cybersecurity and on Internet Governance. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the global rules of the game and the dangers that he sees in this field. Carl, you have the floor.
Thanks, and I try to do that fairly briefly. Just starting by saying, which I think we should be aware of, that when we are discussing cybersecurity and related issues, we are really discussing the global order of the rapidly evolving digital age. Because our dependence upon these systems is increasing enormously fast. The internet is already the most important infrastructure of the world, and that has happened very fast. And it's also rapidly becoming the infrastructure of every other infrastructure of the world. And that means that the security and the stability of these different aspects of those particular systems, that is not only the security and stability of those systems, it's the security of our economies, the security of our society, to some extent the security of our lives in the future. So the task of safeguarding the security and stability of the devices, the networks, the software, and all of this is really fundamental. And to do this in a world of states that were built in an age where borders were a question of physical walls, is not entirely easy. We have to enter areas that challenge the Westphalian order in quite a number of different ways. There have been numerous attempts underway to establish the rules of the game, the order, the governance. I've been involved in one commission, Global Commission, that I led, and another one where I'm participating, which is now looking primarily at the stability of cyberspace, safeguarding what we call the multi-stakeholder model of governance, safeguarding some rules concerning surveillance and credibility of the system, safeguarding or establishing a norm for protection of the core of the internet, so that states and others who have other interests sometimes don't tamper with the key functions and core functions of the net. That has happened in the past, but that is very dangerous if it happens. But then there are numerous other attempts underway on the bilateral state level, on the multilateral level, to try to establish the rules of the game. And just briefly on those, there have been, as we are aware of, Chinese-American dialogue on trying to limit cyber espionage for economic reasons. I mean, it was for economic reasons. I don't think anyone, any state, is particularly interested to outlawing espionage intelligence activities in general. And if they did, no one would believe them anyhow. But in this particular case, they have been trying to at least moderate behavior in this particular area. That has latterly been taken up by others. There's been a process under the auspices of the United Nations, the so-called governmental group of experts. I think there have been 4 of those or 5 of those, whatever. And they have agreed on certain things, primarily what happens in open conflict and war between states. And they have agreed that the laws of war apply in cyberspace, but the laws of war, by definition, they apply during war. And I think most of the discussion that we're having now is which are the rules that apply when it's not war, and it's not the rules of the war primarily. And the latest attempt in that particular UN format, which includes both sort of the permanent members and a number of other countries, India was part of it, Estonia and other others, that failed to come to an agreement. And it failed to come to an agreement on a number of specific issues. One was that they agreed that states are not allowed to attack critical infrastructure. I think that they can agree on. Then what is the critical infrastructure? Then it becomes very difficult. And when it was inserted in the process also the question of that they should respect international humanitarian law, that was one bridge too far. Because international humanitarian law, then that would take out cyber operations of a sort that could have some sort of civilian damage, that could have some sort of effect on civilian life, and then it becomes too broad, and the entire effort collapsed. So that's where we are, without any defined rules of the games. Are we then supposed to be worried? I think we should be worried. And what worries me most at the moment is the proliferation of attempts by states to establish what they call network operations sometimes, or what they call perhaps offensive capabilities of different sorts. And that worries me because the weapons that they develop, if we use that particular, or the technologies that they develop, they have certain characteristics. In contrast to kinetic war, when you bomb someone, you send a bomb, and either you hit or you don't hit, but the bomb disappears. That's for certain. If you do that in the cyber world, you send a cyber weapon of the one sort or the other, you might hit it or not, but the weapon doesn't disappear. On the contrary, the weapon is there, and the weapon can be taken by someone, redone, and sent back. And then it can become rather difficult. It's also that these particular weapons or technologies, they can spread fairly easily, and they are difficult to control. Nuclear weapons are fairly cumbersome, expensive devices, but these particular devices are not necessarily that easy to control. The most recent example, just to make clear what I mean, is what happened with the WannaCry virus, where you had weapon is perhaps too strong a word, but anyhow, a cyber sort of attack device that was developed by, guess whom, the National Security Agency of the United States, and for some reason, in some way, that particular technology weapon was leaked, stolen, became available, and was picked up by, according to what is said, the North Koreans, a state that we don't attribute too many other technological attributes to except nuclear weapons. So they remodeled it, sent it out for purposes we can discuss, and it nearly brought down the national health system of the United Kingdom, among other places. So this vividly illustrates the dangers that are there. When some competent states, and there are some competent states, some semi-competent states, and there are lots of those, and some utterly incompetent states that believe that are competent, starts to develop these particular systems. And when they believe they're under attack by someone, and they probably misunderstand whom they are attacked by, they attack against, and then they get a counterattack. And most nations, I would argue, are extremely vulnerable. If you want to build up offensive capabilities, be certain that your entire society is properly defended, and no society is. So here we have a situation that could easily get out of control, particularly when you start applying also automated system, perhaps artificial intelligence system to these. So you have automatic cyber defense reactions to what is perceived as cyber offensive operations. Then you can easily see the global digital system spiraling out of control in a system in a way that is profoundly dangerous. Conclusion of this: increase awareness on all levels of the need to build defensive systems and defensive systems and well-defended and secure networks, but also accelerate efforts on the global level to establish the rules of the games, what states are allowed to do, what states should not be allowed to do, and also the responsibilities that states have for activities that originate in their respective territories. This is a question of the security and safety of all of our societies in the digital future. Otherwise, it's going to be very dangerous.
Thank you, Carl. That was Useful and slightly worrying, I must admit. I mean, essentially, you are saying there are really no defined rules of the game. How would you go about establishing these rules? Do we need a sort of Geneva Convention on cybersecurity?
Well, some are advocating that at some point in time that might well happen. Yeah, well, some Microsoft to be precise. At some point in time that might happen. But I don't think, I fear it's too early. I mean, the attempts that have been done have failed, as I said. And perhaps you can say that establishing the Westphalian system of state behavior in that particular word took quite a number of conflicts and quite some time. And unfortunately, I fear that we need, or states need to learn the dangers the hard way before they are ready to make the compromises necessary in order to establish something along those lines. That's a somewhat pessimistic conclusion, but I think that's where we are.
Well, that really does worry me, I must admit. And not to mention the non-state actors who would be beyond the reach of any state agreement anyway.
Absolutely, I didn't mention that. And also the difference between the two is also fluid, because there's obviously states that use non-state actors to do things that they don't want
deniability.
Deniability of.
Well, I think the next speaker may know a little bit about that. Ido Mud is a cybersecurity coordinator with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel, and he's going to talk to us about global cyber stability and state responsibility. Ido, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. At the outset, let me thank the ORF for this very kind invitation to be here and to speak to you tonight at this wonderful conference. A few words from a diplomatic perspective, also from an Israeli perspective, about cyber stability and global stability. I think it's clear also from the remarks by the previous speaker that we can't speak of cyber stability. There are too many unknowns, and too much is uncontrolled, neither by governments nor by the industry. The question is, this is perhaps something that we can ask at the end of this conference, having heard cyber being repeated so often that I was thinking about this movie, The Bride Princess. Keep saying that word, but I'm not sure it means what you think it means. So we are here at the end of this conference, and we heard cyber connected to so many topics, to healthcare, to economic development, to growth, to stability, to global stability. And I think this is really the question that drives states to have more awareness and to be more involved in cybersecurity. And actually, when we're talking about cyber, we are talking about two things, two very important things, I think. That one is confidence in people and their governments, and confidence between states in their cooperation, which is somewhat changing in the realm of cyber, and the integrity of the very integrity of the democratic system. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu also mentioned this here when he spoke about the power of democracy. And this is, I think, the most important value that we are looking to protect when we are talking about cybersecurity. So we are talking about systems and networks and, of course, data. But at the end of the day, we want to assure that people have free and safe access to information for the sake of social and economic development and so on. And so when we are talking about that, that makes a little bit more sense, having heard cyber being discussed so frequently and so often in the last few days. And very importantly, if we're talking about the global instability, of course, there is a military part, but cyber is mostly in a civilian domain. And so we are talking about peacetime norms and peacetime cybersecurity. And I think the main focus is for governments is to protect the democratic system, as I mentioned. At the moment, I think, since the mechanisms, the global mechanisms, are having a hard time bringing experts and government officials and academics and practitioners and technologists together to agree on what needs to be done, most of the steps are taken by nation states. So the regulation and the incentives and the structural defense mechanism, all of that is done on a separate basis. There is a very important effort now done by the European Union with two very important regulations, the General Data Protection Regulation and the Network Information System Security Regulation, which will change, will have global effects because everybody will have to, well, the first one, the GDPR mostly, most countries will have, and industries will have to address that and find ways to work with that. So maybe this is a process that has begun, which was not intended to have such a global impact, but it does. And just 2 words looking forward. So the GG, the group of governmental experts that was not able to successfully come up with conclusions on the global process, that in itself is not a bad thing. The process started in 1999. There were several meetings of this group. I suppose that it's time now to do a sort of to work in breakout groups, as we may call it, to have like-minded countries first agree better and have an easier understanding what we are talking about when we are talking about cybersecurity, and then come back for a global forum and continue there with the help of other fora. The informal track, which is of course very, very important, and that involves also other players, which are very important part, the industry, the industry and academia, which actually create this domain. Governments have no bearing on how it's being developed. They are just trying to cope with it. Israel has created its cybersecurity strategy based on 2 tenets, on 2 pillars. One is the economic pillar, and the most important one is, of course, security. And they feed each other. And I think when we're looking forward, we have to look in both directions. One is to be able to better deter the malevolent players, but also work on the economic and the technological development, on innovation, and work together between states, but also across borders as much as possible to create new solutions out of the box fora that will help us to enhance cybersecurity. So I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Sorry, I was having a rather old-fashioned electronic problem turning this on. I wondered if I can pursue with you the question that I alluded to with Carl, which is about the non-state actors and the threat they pose. Already we are dealing with weaponry which a state can in any case use with deniability, right? Unlike a bomb or a missile, which usually can be traced to its place of origin, you can have malware and cyber attacks that can't easily be traced. And this becomes all the more dangerous in the hands of non-state actors as well. Israel has a fair share of non-state actors to deal with as part of your general security challenges. Do you have a specific approach when it comes to dealing with them in the cybersecurity domain?
We have a very specific approach to cybersecurity, which also addresses the non-state actors. And that is a sort of a 3-level approach. So at the very basic level, that would mean that organizations and individuals will have to protect themselves and maintain their own so-called hygiene. They will be guided by the National Cybersecurity Authority and given ideas what to do, but it's their own responsibility. And the next level would be, once an organization or an entity is attacked, they will have to be able to resume business continuity as fast as possible. They may be helped and supported by government entities, but only at the 3rd level, which is a national level, we are looking at the attacker. In that case, that may be also the non-state actors, and we are familiar with them. So what we are doing is making sure that our defense is well in place and that other entities, those that deal with intelligence gathering and do the scouting and do whatever is necessary to protect Israel, are also aware of that threat and take the necessary precautions to protect Israel.
Okay, thanks very much. Our 3rd speaker, Kaja Ciglic, is Director of Cybersecurity Policy and Strategy at Microsoft. And she's really our first voice entirely from the private sector. It'd be good to hear from her about how the private sector is coping and indeed how it's dealing with the public sector, whether there's enough cooperation between them as they help us all deal with cybersecurity. Kaja, you have the floor. I would urge speakers to approach the mic as much as possible because we're getting some competition from extraneous sounds. Sorry.
Okay. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you. So I think we've heard a fair amount about how the public sector approaches cybersecurity, and particularly in the international arena. And I think what I'd want to touch upon is what I think is one of the main challenges in this space, which is the fact that the private sector and the public sector sometimes willingly, and sometimes unintentionally don't necessarily understand each other. I think the two groups come to the issue from very different perspectives. And I think and as a result, neither of them has a complete understanding what effects and impacts cyber offensive operations could have. If we look at the private sector at the beginning, I think the private sector overall still sees the online environment as basically the land of opportunity and innovation, and has really failed in the past 10 years to basically notice that governments have come and started investing in cyberspace. It's only something that I think that the private sector has started paying attention in the last couple of years. Has not participated in any of the discussions on potential regulation or governance of behavior in cyberspace. And as a result, also has not changed in its thinking about the threat models that we apply to protect our systems. If you look overall at the basically mass market products available, very few have been designed with the idea in mind that perhaps your best customers, often governments, might be the same people who are actually using it to attack, using your product, exploiting your product to attack other customers of yours. Very few, if any, of these products have been built to basically resist military-grade attacks. On the other hand, I think the public sector actually has at heart a very correct desire to protect the public, to protect the international system, but oftentimes look at it at trying to protect the system from vulnerabilities or problems that are from yesterday, not even today, and definitely not those that are coming tomorrow or in 2 years' time. So the sort of excitement about investing in cyber weapons, offensive cyber weapons, is done with oftentimes with fairly short-term thinking about what is my immediate military gain versus understanding what has digital transformation, the fact that pretty much every company and every individual today is connected, and not just connected to the internet, but connected to everything else, what that has meant, and what can it mean if a cyber weapon is deployed. Carl talked about WannaCry, but WannaCry was not a very sophisticated attack. You know, what happens when, and it spread like wildfire, what happens when there are significant attacks used, when states retaliate against each other. I think today earlier, the gentleman from Red Cross talked about the need for proportionality, the need for understanding the impact of a particular attack. How many countries will actually have the capability to understand what will happen when they let a cyber weapon go into space? So I think we need to sort of reset our thinking, I think on both sides, the public and the private, and also work together. I think Microsoft sort of was mentioned earlier today, just now. Microsoft proposed a Digital Geneva Convention as a long-term sort of goal, but looked at it predominantly as a sort of a opportunity to work on actual text, on an actual convention, so bringing governments together. Work also on a tech sector accord component on it, which to make sure to bring the industry together to come to a set of commitments on how to behave responsibly in cyberspace, and on an attribution council, which sort of we envision to bridge public, private, and civil society to help evolve our thinking about attribution and where attacks are coming from. And then on the other side, and sort of looking at not just international, but perhaps implementing some of the security and defenses at national level. You know, whether you look at the UNGG 2015, a lot of the recommendations in there were solid defense recommendations, not just related to the offensive aspects to it. Sort of protect your critical infrastructure, establish certs. I think we need to see much more of those efforts in regulations or otherwise at national level around the world.
Thank you, Kaja. I want to take you up on that digital Geneva Convention idea. The Geneva Convention, as all of you in the room know, I'm sure, really sets standards for how to behave in wartime. And if a state violates the Geneva Conventions, a state can be held accountable. Now, with the digital Geneva Convention, we face the following problem. Just as how in the regular Geneva Conventions, if the violation occurs because of by a terrorist group or some drugged 16-year-old kid at a Sierra Leonean checkpoint, the Geneva Convention is essentially ineffective because there is no mechanism to apply it there. What do you do in a situation where actors in the cybersecurity space are not only themselves difficult to identify, but may, to a very great extent, not be states or state-backed at all? How would a digital convention work with them?
It wouldn't necessarily. So the proposals that we put forward was largely completely focused on the sort of a proposal for responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, and sort of we envisioned it as a evolution of the international law as it exists now, because we see there are several gaps that states exploit. I think a little bit like with the traditional Geneva Conventions, no solution is perfect, but we hope that it would A, spark debate, B, if it's eventually adopted in probably 15 plus years time, I think that it will actually signal what is responsible and what is not responsible behavior. I think you will always have violations, but hopefully having a framework, having set rules of behavior also means that countries will think twice before they act. I think in terms of attribution is hard, but attributions has improved dramatically over the past few years in the private sector and then also on the state side. And sort of the last we've seen, although the last attribution we've seen was, I think, just late December, where the US, the UK, Australia, Japan, and I feel another country attributed WannaCry publicly to North Korea. It just takes time and it's hard, right? The scenario, I think, which is terrifying is the one that was talked about earlier, where you see an attack and a country reacts immediately. WannaCry happened in May. They only attributed in December. It takes time. So I think we see it as a mechanism that would signal restraint, but not necessarily something that will solve all problems.
No, it won't necessarily achieve it, depending on who the wrongdoer is. Sean Paul McGurk is a senior policy advisor with the Industrial Control Systems Information Sharing and Analysis Center, quite a mouthful. He's been a military officer, he's worked in government. He is an expert on infrastructure protection. How do you deal with cyber security threats to things like electric grids and nuclear power plants and so on? Sean, give us your take on this.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to address the group today and also the opportunity to participate with my distinguished panelists. I want to start off with a little story. I was the director of the National Cybersecurity Center for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security on July in 2010. I vividly remember that day because I was standing on the watch floor. It was 9:10 a.m. after just completing my morning brief when one of our analysts identified a particular piece of malware which had very sophisticated capabilities. That malware later became known as Stuxnet. That, for me, was a game-changing event when it came to the cyber domain. What we have seen over time is the sophistication of the levels of attack are no longer associated specifically with a nation-state or a nation-state sponsored actor. Once the capability has been demonstrated, the proverbial Pandora's box was opened, there was no way to put that weapon back in or to prevent its proliferation or its modifications. Within a few months after Stuxnet being publicly traded on the dark web to threat actors, It was modified, and it was relaunched as a new piece of malware, which was later known as Shamoon. Shamoon had the capability of destroying data facilities and data storage capabilities. Very interesting approach. Shamoon campaign would go in, and it was attributed to a particular threat actor and targeted 2 facilities in the Middle East, a petrochemical facility and a natural gas facility. What Shamoon did was it stopped your backups for about a month, and you were backing up essentially nothing. And then it wiped your entire enterprise architecture, so you lost all of your data records and you lost all of your backups. So subsequently, these companies lost billions of dollars in revenue because they were unable to conduct business. In one case, Qatar Rasgas was the primary exporter of natural gas to South Korea. They export about 324 billion cubic feet per year, and we saw a significant impact on the manufacturing capacity of South Korea as a result of this one cyber campaign. And there have been numerous others. Madi was a modification of Flame, which was a Stuxnet 2 type of approach. And the reason I'm going through this litany of various cyber weapons, because truly that's what they are. It's not necessarily ransomware, which wants to lock up your data and extract some form of payment. There are organizations out there, and in some cases individuals, whose sole purpose is to deny, disrupt, and destroy your capability of doing business. It's no longer about just securing systems. It's about actually having physical impacts in the actual world. So a virtual weapon has a physical kinetic impact. Just last month, a new type of cyber weapon was discovered and impacted another petro facility in the Middle East. And this was currently termed a TriSys or Tricon. This is a new step above what we've seen in the past. This particular malware targets safety systems. To understand the impact of safety systems, they are ubiquitous. They're in every device that we use, every system that we have, from nuclear facilities to the elevators in the hotel, where you could essentially override the safety system and cause the elevator to plummet from the top floor to the bottom floor. So this is the focus that these types of capabilities have today, and these are the types of activities that we're seeing from some of these threat actors. It was mentioned earlier, attribution is difficult. Attribution is getting better. The challenge is if you're attributing a particular malware based on its techniques, tactics, and procedures, or TTP, to a group known as APT28, but it's actually being used by another criminal organization for a separate goal, it makes that actual attribution very difficult. So in focusing on how do we address these very sophisticated cyber weapons, we focus more now on not necessarily the who from an attribution standpoint or the how did they get in through persistent presence, but why are they attacking your infrastructure? What is the intent? What is the purpose? And what is the benefit, either financial or from a business reputation standpoint? So when we're looking at these types of weapons and this type of capability, we really need to focus on a very global position when it comes to addressing the threats. The challenge we have today is it doesn't have to be a nation state. It doesn't have to be nation state sponsored. It doesn't have to be a criminal organization. It could be a series of individuals, what we refer to as criminal use of the internet as the focus and function behind it. So hopefully I've gave you something to think about when it comes to how we're moving forward in the cyber domain.
Well, it's still worrying. Sean, tell us, is there one thing that you wish the world were doing that we aren't doing to deal with all of this?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and it was mentioned earlier, is putting together global information sharing protocols and regimes. The challenge we have today is the threat actors are moving at the speed of the machine. Companies, unfortunately, private sector and governments are moving at the speed of bureaucracy. So it's really a matter of putting not necessarily command and control from an autonomous response standpoint, but having autonomous sharing capability so that if I see an attack coming into the financial sector, that same indicator or that same artifact may be all of a sudden appearing in the energy sector. And I would like to be able to basically share machine to machine those capabilities and those artifacts so that we can have a more global protective approach.
More sharing. I think that's in fact an important link to our next speaker, because there will be issues about the extent to which information sharing is taking place in India. Gulshan Rai is the National Cybersecurity Coordinator in the Indian Prime Minister's office. And it'll be very instructive, Gulshan, for you to bring all these general global principles down to one country, ours, and tell us how we're coping or if we are.
Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to address. I was hearing very patiently the comments and the position of my panelists there. But when I compare the 2016 and 2017, I certainly agree with my earlier previous panelists, that the cybersecurity scenario in general, whether in India or worldwide, is becoming more and more alarming there. The cyber attacks are becoming more complex. The examples was given in the name of WannaCry or the PetaCry or whatever the recent Middle East or the chip level kind of vulnerabilities has been detected. It certainly has, it shakes the confidence of a common person who has a little understanding about the cyber and want to use more and more cyber, particularly in India when we are going in a flagship Digital India program and focusing on the digital payment and digital cash, which our Prime Minister is focusing there. Now, with the complexity of the cyber incident, certainly the technologies has also made an impact there. The technologies like artificial intelligence or the machine learning or the TORs, those kind of a darknet, dark web, are certainly impacting and aggravating the cyber scenario worldwide and including India there. The couple of years ago, the traffic which was observed from the darknet was quite less. Today, there is a significant traffic on the darknet and dark web. Anything you want, you can get on the darknet, dark web. In fact, every law enforcement agencies world over, they monitor the darknet per se to understand what are the data which is being sold, what data has been stolen. They get the darknet and then they start discovering the vulnerability. Now, the complex cyber incident has also made the cyber governance also too complex. There are issues of the capacity development. In fact, capacity development is one of the single most significant issue in making the scenario of cybersecurity more and more grim there. The new equipment coming, new softwares coming, new updates coming with a lesser skill or the gap in the acquiring the skill, that challenge is becoming a very, very challenge. Then there are issues of the legal framework, legal issues, both when we look at the domestic or the international, and one of the factor was said that was the exchange of information there. And in the absence of any international law or even the Budapest Convention, all countries not coming to agreement on the framework. There are issues on the exchange of information, at least in understanding or in agreeing to the format of how or what format will exchange information. There are serious differences when we talk about the attribution of the incidents there. There are issues. Attribution incident is one, but at least there should be a mindset to attribute, to work together for the attribution of the incident. That itself is an issue. And the posture of the states is also becoming more and more harder as we started knowing more and more about how the cyber things are becoming there. There are issues relating to privacy. We were discussing before entering this room. We have to see how the GDPR function there, how the GDPR complication it comes up in terms of the on the security there. And one of the issue I was mentioning there, while the GDPR cover extensively about the IP address, but what about the MAC address? There also identifies the entire system much more than the IP address. So these are the issues which making the cyber governance extremely difficult. But when it comes to India, we have also the same challenges. We are the second largest internet users in the world. We have the more than 2 billion IoT devices. We are implementing the smart cities there. Our digital transactions per day is surpassed 2.2 billion per day. That's the what kind of a thing which we are dealing with this. And the issues are also becoming more and more challenged to it. How do we propose to deal? We had the cybersecurity policy in 2013. Now we are looking at it. What gaps are there in light of the technologies which are coming up, which have come up, and what the international policies have come up. How do we plug those gaps so that we can move on and we can catch up and we can address the challenges there. The focus is on preparing our organizations to detect, mitigate, and recover from the incident, enhance the resilience of the systems there. And our focus is also largely on the capacity development, manpower development, a short-term, medium, long-term courses there. And we are focusing both the formal sector and the informal sector there. The implementation of the best practices is also a primary focus to safe and secure kind of a transactions there. More and more Indian systems are moving towards the private sector. So we are also working very closely. There is a joint working group of the industry, public and private sector with the government there. And we are trying to involve how do we work together because the involvement of the private sector is far more important if we have to address our cybersecurity challenges. We are in the process of developing a privacy and protection framework. The public consultation has started. Of course, it will take some time before the draft legislation comes back. And we are also very eagerly looking at the May 2018 when the GDPR also comes in the implementing stage, and we see what the pitfall things are there. We have seen the multilateral forum where cyber discussion happens. The reference was made about the UNGGE. So our focus is more on having a bilateral discussion, come to understanding of the bilateral kind of a understanding, and then we can look at the multilateral. So our focus is on the bilateral kind of things. We really have a challenge because our population, number of devices going up there, number of connections going up, and we intend to work more closely both with the domestic companies, the foreign companies, to address our challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Gulshanji. I need to probe you on one thing, however. One of the challenges we seem to have in India in dealing with cybersecurity is, if I understand it correctly, there are 18 different government agencies and ministries with dispersed responsibility for aspects of cybersecurity. Have you been able to pull them together under yourself? Is there a mechanism that's being planned? Because if not, surely the very point that one of our panelists made earlier, that something happens in one domain, I think it was Sean who said this, an attack happens in one area, you will need to be able to anticipate it happening in another area, but if there's no meaningful coordination or information sharing, you'll never be able to do that. Is that happening in India?
No, it started happening about a couple of years ago. We had, as I said, we evolved the cybersecurity framework and strategy there. The position of National Cybersecurity Coordinator was created at the PMO level. There are not 18 agencies there. There are about eight agencies there. The role of 8 agencies were clearly delineated there. The Internal Security, one Ministry of Home Affairs there, critical protection sector with one organization, cybersecurity in general with one organization, telecom kind of thing with Department Telecom, cybercrime again with MHA. So there are about 7 or 8 kind of organizations which are involved. Yes, initially we had a problem because it's a multi-stakeholder kind of a system. There are every challenge is there. We have moved quite positively forward in that, and I'm sure as the time goes on, we'll be able to move it. We are having regular meeting, at least with the clear stakeholder monthly meeting. Day to day, we are in touch. We are having a meeting with the industry, with the different regulators, which on a very regular basis. Now, what we are trying to do, we have a number of regulators there. If you look at the financial sector, we have a Reserve Bank of India, Central Bank. We have a Security Exchange Board of India, which is looks after the stock exchanges, and then we have Insurance Regulatory Authority there. That itself is a challenge there. People may say that banking is a challenge, but my view, the stock exchanges and those kind of things are more challenges, because anywhere from any part of the world can do the transactions, come and do the transaction in central server. And bank transaction, if you move from one bank to another bank, there is a trail, complete trail. And that's why the world over, they are trying to address the issues when it comes to illegal stealing of money by the attacks there. So we are trying to bring, our focus is to bring three regulator, and that's why we are, in the last budget, we had announced the setting of the financial cert. Hopefully that will come, and that will completely integrate the three major sector. And why we are focusing more on that, because the financial attacks on the financial sector have overall increased, whether we talk about the world or as well as the country there.
Thank you, Gulshanji. All right, I'm going to, before we open it up to the audience, I'm going to invite the other panelists to comment on what they've heard, particularly what they heard after they spoke, but also if they didn't get a chance to respond to what they've heard from the other panelists. I should mention Sean Paul McGurk did warn us in advance he has a flight to catch, and I wouldn't want him to miss his journey home. So may I give you the floor first, Sean?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I just found that most of the comments that we made today are very coordinated when it comes to what each of us from our various perspectives is really focusing on, which is how do we better protect on a global basis. The challenge with cyber domain is ones and zeros don't carry passports. There's no such thing as national boundaries or borders when it comes to cybersecurity. It has to be a global effort and has to be a global focus, which means we have to put in place these infrastructures that enable us to share information openly and freely between both the public sector and the private sector, so that we can meet those requirements and overcome the challenges of not being able to enforce a digital Geneva Convention. Today, we're still trying to focus on fixing a digital Maginot Line. So we have quite a challenge ahead of us, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts with you all.
Thank you very much, Sean. Do state till you really feel you have to leave, and if you have to leave now, thank you very much for your participation. The Maginot Line is an unfortunate historical illusion, because as you all know, the Maginot Line was bypassed. So that is not necessarily the precedent we all want. Carl, Kaja, Ido, do you have comments on what you've heard from the other panelists? Carl?
Just a couple of additions. I think we all agree that there's a need for global dialogue. I think we all agree that to arrive at a quick solution is unlikely. It might be sort of informal networks, it might be coalitions of governments who are going to develop it. Let me just say that word also warning that in this particular global dialogue, where everyone is concerned about cybersecurity, we should be aware of the fact that there are regimes that have agendas that in certain aspects might not necessarily be in conformity with what we would like to see in free and open societies, where the protection of the individual and privacy and human rights are concerns that are important. I think you know roughly what I'm talking about. Second comment, which is slightly related when it comes to the international dialogue, it was mentioned that there are no borders and boundaries in cyberspace. When you talk about non-state actors, say criminal networks of different sorts, you can be dead certain that if they're doing something bad in your country, they do it from another country. And we do have, the Budapest Convention was mentioned, and we've got multilateral assistance treaties and things like that in order to sort out these particular issues. They are exceedingly slow. They are in no way adjusted to the modern world of the necessity to safeguard the rule of the law within countries and between countries. And this is leading to a lot of legal chaos at the moment. Also, I see it primarily in the transatlantic sphere between the European Union and the US, in different cases that are there with the European Court of Justice and with the US system. But this needs also to be thought through in order to have the possibility to safeguard the stability and security of cyberspace.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Kaja, Ido, yes, go ahead. All right, Kaja then.
I would just say, I think to reiterate, I think there's no easy solutions, right? I think whether it's a convention, whether it's an agreement, whatever it is, you should never. But also, if you think about it domestically or even within an organization or on your personal device, security is not an end point. It's a continuous risk assessment and evaluation of what's going on. Just as technology advances, so do risks, so do problems. So there will never be just one point in end time and be, okay, now we solved it. So I think I would keep that in mind. At the same time, I would also say, I sort of talked about industry, but I think it's important to remember that in today's day and age, the technology is developed by all companies. It's developed by BMW, is developed by Goldman Sachs, is across the board. Even taking out the smaller companies bringing IoT, Internet of Things devices and innovative solutions on the market every day. So I think we need to find also a way to take some of the lessons that have been learned on protecting and securing software and devices over the past 10 years and sort of spread it across the industry rather than just have it retained in the tech sector itself. But on the positive note, I would also say, yes, the world is really scary, but software is actually becoming more secure. I think that the challenge ultimately are still the people. I think a lot of the attacks that we see are based on the people clicking on a phishing email. A lot of the vulnerabilities and mistakes in software are based on just the code is really complex, and until humans will be involved, there will always be mistakes. But there is improvement, so I also don't want to everyone just be really terrified.
Okay, Ido.
Just a quick point about some contradiction in terms about cybersecurity, perhaps. And to the question that you asked Mr. Rai about, Dr. Rai, about who is responsible, I think that from our approach, we found that having one central entity that is responsible or that is coordinating and is the director for cybersecurity works well, but you need to have all the other players assume responsibility just as much. So the division of labor must be very, very clear, and everybody, and that includes everybody, has to assume responsibility for cybersecurity. And this is not an issue for the geeks, and it's not an issue for the security people. It's an issue for everyone. And this is a point that I think is very, very important. As we've been discussing cyber throughout the day in many ways and shapes and forms, that means that in every institution, in every organization, every individual that deals with technology, there is a link, he is a link, or that institution is a link to cyber, to general cybersecurity. So we think that what would work in Israel would also work globally, and that means that we should have multiple players be involved, take responsibility, share the responsibility, and make sure that we all move in the same direction. And I think that is the hardest part, agreeing more or less where we're going. Thank you.
Okay, Gulshanji, do you have anything to add to this discussion?
No, I have only 2 or 3 points to add. The world has adopted the multi-stakeholder approach of cyber governance. That is everyone, after a long debate, has adopted there. While the stakeholders, everyone is a stakeholder, but I think we need to clearly delineate the responsibility of the industry also. If we have to move positively towards the cyber security and cyber safety, industry will have to play a much lead role as compared to what they are doing. There should be certain liabilities, certain responsibilities to the industry. This aspect in all the multinational forum is somehow not been addressed the way it should have been addressed. That's one point. Second, it has also come around today's discussion that the non-state actors are playing a predominant role in terms of creating the cyber weapons, cyber attacks on all kind of things. Any of the multilateral forum or even the bilateral forum there, I think we need to define, we need also to start thinking how we bring the these non-state actors also into the picture, whether from the international law point of view or the domestic law point of view. That we need to do that. And the third, which is more important thing, is that the exchange of information regarding the cyber attacks. The position of the states are becoming more and more harder until and unless we agree on a common format, the more transparent and broader approach. I have my own issue, doubt whether we'll be able to ever address the issues there. In this regard, the mutual legal assistance treaty is there. That assumes a very, very significant role. And the better we address the mutual legal assistance treaty, they think the better it will be in the interest of the trade, interest of the multilateral agreement, or the multilateral things. I'll give you one example. In the last UNGGE, there was one norms of behavior was the attribution there. While one set of people were insisting on attribution, other set of countries were talking it's a military kind of a thing. I don't know how, without attributing it, one will solve the issues of international law, whether it's a self-defense or a countermeasures or what all you talk about it. Without attributing the incidents there, how will one address those issues there? So I think these are the issues. It's better we try to resolve in a transparent and efficient manner. Better it will be for us to move in a digital or a cyber ecosystem.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it to the audience. Do we have mics, folks? Any organizers here with mics, handheld mics? Yes? Okay. So let's go right to the back. The first hand that went up was those two at the back. Yeah. And please identify yourselves so that the panelists know who is asking them the question. Yes, your name, where you're from, what you do, very briefly. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Next one is the gentleman behind. Yeah.
My name is Leah Kasper. I run an internet policy organization that works on digital rights based in the UK. My question is to Mr. Rai. So we heard from a number of panelists as well as in the session beforehand about how difficult it is to come to agreement or global consensus on acceptable norms or rules for state behavior in cyberspace. The GGE has basically failed. It said that international humanitarian law applies, but not much else. Where we go from there, I don't know. And whether or not that's an area that we should focus on, I'm not so sure. My question is actually on an area where I think improvements and progress can be made, and that is cybercrime. And you yourself and Mr. Bildt mentioned the Budapest Convention, which is obviously developed by the Council of Europe. However, it does have a number of non-Council of Europe members and signatories. I think at the moment it's about 56, including the US, including Israel, including Japan, Australia, and others. My question would be, what would it take for India to sign the Budapest Convention? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I must, I must also give you my view. I won't agree that the UNGGA dialogue failed. Yes, it requires little more discussion. Issues were brought up there, and I think more intensive debate, the kind of issues there. There were different views. So I won't say within the time span of 1 week, it was very difficult to come to any understanding. So I rather will not say it failed, but we say that we need more discussion on those issues there. That's one. Second is that in the past we have been asking the European Commission number of our clarification on the Budapest Convention. I'm afraid those clarification we are still awaiting there. So once those clarification comes there, we certainly will be taking a further, a decision in our country how to proceed further.
Okay, at the back.
Hi, my name is Anurag. I'm a researcher in terrorism and internet. My question is to Mr. Rai. Regarding, it's been in the news that since 2016 and 2017, cyber crimes in India are on the rise, especially with the banking transactions. And the statement issued by Ministry of Home Affairs was that every state would have a cyber cell. My question is that establishing a cyber cell is a good point, but what about teaching the staff or the handlers of those cybercrime incidents, are there any government policies targeting or educating the staff and the general common public about the cybersecurity issues? And the second question is about the countering the radicalization of extremism, where most of the terror outfits like Al-Qaeda and IS, they are having their online social media establishment through the magazines, which can be accessible and which are accessible easily. And as you mentioned that all the Indian agencies are monitoring the dark web, my question is that there are provisions to access those material through the VPN, which is virtual private network. Are there any provisions in the cybersecurity strategy of India to tackle those VPN networks as well? Thank you.
First of all, let me correct on two accounts there. I did not say that Indian agencies are monitoring darknet. I said word over law enforcement agency, do look at the darknet, get the information. There's a difference what I said and what you are trying to put words in my mouth. That's one point. Number two, the number of cyber crimes are not increasing only in India, it's increasing worldwide there. That's a position there. I think those two positions, we should correct it. It's you see, India is a large country with a large police personnel and large other factors are there. And as I said in my comments there, that the capacity development is one of the focus area which government is focusing there. We have started a formal, non-formal kind of a courses there to the sectors to educate, to enhance the skills of the people. And I think as the time goes on, we're trying to create a specialized kind of a system there. The engineering programs have been retrofitted, special programs have already been initiated there. So we are moving in this direction, but the innovation in technology is also posing a lot of challenges there.
Thank you. Lata Reddy had asked for the floor, the mic in the middle, please. She was a commissioner with Carl Bildt on the Global E-Governance Commission. Lata.
Thank you. Thank you, Shashi. And Carl, it was a great pleasure of being with you on the Global Commission on Internet Governance, and I'm delighted we're continuing our association in the new Global Commission on the stability of cyberspace. When we had our meeting here in Delhi less than 2 months ago, we issued the call to protect the public core of the internet, which you mentioned briefly in your presentation. We in the Commission defined the core as being the infrastructure that provides stability and security to the entire internet globally. It's not something that we just want to protect in one country, but globally, which echoes the point which Mr. Gulshan Rai made, that these are global issues for which we need global solutions. Specifically, this includes the naming and forwarding functions of the internet, the trust certificates and cables. This I would actually like to pose to the whole panel. Do you think this infrastructure needs special protection? And which ones do you think are the ones I've mentioned the only ones? Are there other ones we need to look at? And most importantly, how?
Wow, I think that's going to be that's going to take a thesis and response. Who all would like to tackle that? Kaja?
So, and Microsoft's part of the commission. So I think we fully agree with the commission statements. I think, and actually probably agree with all of the ones that you all of the ones that you mentioned. The rationale for it, why the core of the internet needs special protection, is it underpins basically all of our economy today. A little bit like there was a discussion, I think it's G7 or G20, that talked about protecting the core frameworks of the financial infrastructure, the sort of the SWIFTs of the world. Same thing. If the integrity of those infrastructures are compromised, not just brought down, but if there is if I hate this word, but everyone uses it, bad actors manage to tamper with the infrastructure, so you don't know whether you can trust it. Is the information that it's giving you correct? I think that severely undermines all that we can do. So, and yes, to sort of the point of how, I think it is a global problem, but it also needs to be implemented domestically, right? A lot of the infrastructure is implemented in each and every country around the world. So putting in place policies and frameworks and having to protect those, but also having a commitment to not attack those, I think are two super important elements to consider in this way.
Carl, would you like to chip in? I must say that you worked in this domain as well as in classic governance. It seems to me we need to invent a new multilateralism to deal with cybersecurity, one that involves governments, but also companies, also tech actors, also consumers, finding new stakeholders, defining roles, responsibilities, restrictions, the way in which money laundering requires us to get banks to know their customers and not process certain kinds of transactions. Can we get companies not to sell certain kinds of ware to certain purchasers? I don't know, but there's a huge new imagination required here.
It's a huge new area that is opening up. And I mean, what has been referred to earlier, so-called multi-stakeholder model, I think is the way to go forward. I mean, you don't apply it in the same way in every aspect of it, but it requires the ability and the special legal competence and capabilities of government. It requires all of the innovative talent that is there in industry and academia, and it requires sort of civil society broadly defined and the principles that we apply in the non-cyber world, and apply this to a whole set of new challenges that are there, that are often beyond the comprehension of most of our states and political systems, to be quite fair. To just add on this protection of the public core of the internet, which Blatter brought up again, just to say that this is important, but it's not easy. Because there have been a couple of cases. Now I forgot the name of this big criminal network, the what was the name of it?
Not Silk Road.
Yeah, it was a silkworm, yes, wasn't it? Yeah, Silk Road, yeah, quite. I mean, one of the absolutely biggest criminal networks that they spent quite some time trying to break, and they had to tamper with the core structures of the internet in order to do it. So it was a good cause and purpose, getting rid of that particular criminal network, but it did things that have sort of implications for the future that are very damaging, because if one can do it for a good cause, then the next one can do it for a cause that might not be that good, and then the third one will do it for a cause that is distinctly bad. And that is why it's important here to establish a norm that, okay, we have to accept that there are things we can't do, even because we would like to do it to serve society. Then another aspect, just to mention that when it comes to protecting things, which has been the focus of attention lately, slightly different, is protecting the physical infrastructure, the cables. I mean, the world is connected by a network of fiber optic cables and satellites and other physical infrastructure that can be both tampered with and physically destroyed. And we must be certain that we have sufficient redundancy in the global system to be able to handle also physical destruction of the infrastructure of the net.
Fair enough, though it was amazing to see those tweets coming out of Aleppo while it was physically being destroyed around there. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Peter Swire. I teach cybersecurity at Georgia Tech in the United States, and I've done these issues in the US government as well. There's one aspect of critical infrastructure that hasn't been mentioned, which is elections, how votes happen in democracy. And a lot of the attention in the last year or two has been on how actors outside one nation can try to influence the content of what people see. But I'm asking about the infrastructure of voting. So hacking voting machines, hacking vote totals as they go from place to place, and also undermining trust. Even if it's not hacked, people can claim that it's hacked. So I'm curious for you all, because this goes to the heart of democracy going forward. How big an issue do you think this is to try to secure and show security in elections? And what are the first steps people should take to try to protect that?
Great. Okay, there's only one politician on the panel, and that's Carl. So, but well, you work for a government as well?
No, I'm the only politician. But we've got to have elections in Sweden in September. We are fairly old-fashioned. in the sense that we have papers that you put in the ballot books and then you sit there counting the things.
Small country.
And it works. Invented by the Greeks, I think, some time ago.
We have electronic voting machines in India, but they're actually not hackable because they don't have any software that you can beam an interference with. You'd actually have to hack the hardware or the embedded chip in every one of 230,000 electronic voting machines to steal an Indian election. So it's not that easy a job. But you've raised an important question, and the possibility of going more and more towards internet voting. I think in Columbus, Ohio, there was an experiment already conducted to do all city elections and referenda on the internet. I'd love to know whether they persisted with that. That was a decade ago when I was there. Did they ever? They didn't. They did that for an experiment and dropped it. Okay. Well, so your question remains hanging fire, Peter.
With your
one of our young fellows. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just a short remark about this. I think it's a very important event, and it's a milestone in cybersecurity in the sense that up until then, everybody was thinking about critical infrastructure in the form of utilities and banks and airports and whatever. And all of a sudden, in June 2016, the Secretary of Homeland Security in the US says, well, actually, we think now that the election system is a critical infrastructure. So that means that critical infrastructure may depend on specific time, not only a specific service or entity, but in time. And the change that it made was also that all of a sudden countries, democratic countries, realized that the very basic tenets of democracy were a target. And that is something that you need to protect. And the question how to protect is, of course, a Swedish system or the Dutch system has worked manually, but also to think together about how do you ensure that the systems remain credible in the public eye. Not just that you have these ballots manual, but people's confidence in the system are undermined, and this is a much more important issue that needs to be addressed on a political level. Just a short remark about the previous question about the norm of the protection of the public, the core of the internet. I think that the work that the Commission is doing is extremely important, just as other fora are doing very hard work to create more confidence and to point states to issues that are higher on the agenda, that go beyond just political bickering, let's say. If it's on the GGE, sometimes that's very much the case, and point them to areas which really deserve more attention. So the core structure of the internet is very important, but also fora like the Organization of Security and Economic Cooperation, the OSCE, which devised a document on confidence building measures, just as important, because that not only has effect on Europe, but it also copied in other areas of the world. So these things work and these things spread, and as long as they remain voluntary, it's easier also for states to adopt and to see how to work together. So that brings actually states closer, and that's very important.
Okay, a question from one of our Raisina young fellows.
Hi, I'm Bhuvan. I'm a journalist with Agence France Press. The thing, over the last few days, we've heard it over and again, how the entire technology and how internet basically brought in disruptions, social, economic, across different parts. And we also have security points, like even Professor right now mentioned about, even if they are not able to hack the EVM electric voting machines, they can still at least propagate that it's been hacked from across nations and without boundaries. Do you think under these circumstances, in the days ahead, there could be, the idea of fragmenting internet into loosely tied islands of sorts would become, it would become an interesting or probably attractive proposition for nation states as they feel threatened, as they feel that the boundaries, etc., nations and nation states' boundaries, etc., are being challenged with the changes that we see around us?
Interesting question. Who wants to take that? Carl?
Well, if you are, say, China, I wouldn't say India, but if you are China, you are fairly big. And of course, they are walling off. They have the great firewall of China. And they can operate sort of their own industries and their own systems, and they have sufficient size for that. And a lot of people think that that is a danger that will happen and they will be isolated from the rest of the world. I'm not quite certain that will be the case. The State Security Ministry of China, of the People's Republic, is very much in favor of this. But if you are a Chinese entrepreneur who are very happy with the Chinese market, certainly, but you want to conquer the world. This is going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem for the development of China long term if they try to isolate themselves. And the same applies to others. I mean, we've had a couple of examples of, I remember in the middle of sort of the Arab Spring when the Egyptians tried to control things by closing down the internet. They thought closing it off from the outside world. Well, I mean, the Cairo Stock Exchange ceased to exist temporarily. And X numbers of other examples. We are getting so interdependent that restricting access too much carries a significant economic and potentially a political price. This is going to go back and forth, and there are the state security that are the interest in certain countries, there are the economic working in one direction, there are the economic and to a certain extent political interests working in the other direction. And you will see this going back and forth in different countries. China is, of course, the obvious example of those trying to make something very protected. Whether they will succeed long term remains to be seen. North Korea evidently doesn't manage to protect itself completely.
Right. Gulshan, you wanted to say something?
See, there are two aspects. One is the technology aspect, as Carl has said, the other is the economic aspects there. While the technology aspect, some people may think, or some countries may think, to set up the fragmented kind of internet, but the economic aspect, as he has rightly brought out, I completely endorse that, will make the technology aspect very low there. But I am very confident. You see, this is an area where every country, no matter what superpower or in what area it has, it is impacting, and the higher the penetration of digital assets, the greater risk is there in those countries there. So I am quite hopeful that the world will come together and ultimately they will address the issues, and they will have to address. They will be addressed there.
Thank you. We really have time for just two more questions. Apologies to the others. Young man right here, and then at the table right to the back to the young lady at the back. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Ved Vyas, I'm with the Observer Research Foundation Cyber Initiative. I'd just like to go back to what we were discussing about the norm of non-interference. And I'd like to observe that this norm on non-interference, which in fact was thrown into the spotlight after the DNC hack, was something that Russia and China had been pushing years ago in forums like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in a letter to the UN, etc. So some claim that the DNC hack and the interference with American election, for which they were always going to get caught, was in fact a roundabout way of pushing that norm, which they had introduced years ago. So my question is this: is there any concern at all that universalization of this norm on non-interference will in fact lead to, and the resulting policy steps thereafter, will lead to a more fractured internet?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, this discussion that is now sort of started after what happened in the US. First, I mean, the DNC hack was a pretty unsophisticated thing. In terms of technology, it was nothing. I would also add that what they found, the biggest secret they found, as I can remember, was that Hillary Clinton had given a speech to Goldman Sachs disclosing the fact that she was in favor of free trade. Then it was the way in which certain politicians in the United States, I don't want to insult the President of the United States, but certain politicians of the United States used that during the election campaign. So it was a pretty unsophisticated thing. To have a norm that you can't interfere in elections, well, it depends on what you mean. I sometimes go and campaign for political friends in other countries. Do I interfere? I'm in favor of the BBC broadcasting news all over the world. That could be also, if they are, could be to the detriment of certain regimes, and could be to the detriment of certain politicians as well. So I think we should be careful here that when we safeguard the election process now, and that said, that we are now hijacked by others, back to China and Russia, that might have a slightly different agenda on these issues than the agenda that sort of our free and democratic societies should be guided by.
Okay. The lady right at that, that's the last question for the evening.
Thank you all. My name is Shamli. I wanted to ask about the relative importance of the cyber threat. So while I agree that it's sort of unforeseen and very complex, how does it compare to existing forms of state warfare and interaction? So is it likely to be used in conjunction with existing forms of interaction, or is there a world in which we can see this becoming a domain where much of state relations takes place?
So I would say that the cyber warfare has definitely been used in war, right? But predominantly, and I think this was mentioned today when we're talking about autonomous weapons, I think today it's used in the times of peace. We see government attacks all the time currently, right? They might not necessarily reach the news every day. They might not be destructive, but are currently perhaps more targeted at spying operations or sort of information gathering informations. But they happen all the time. I think the challenge is when they move into that destructive space, and in particularly where they impact civilian populations, right? I think traditionally, if you conducted activities that are sort of in the offline space, you had a specific target, and the attack couldn't spread couldn't spread without you controlling it. I think that's not always possible anymore, and I think that's where the challenges lie. So I think we'll see both a continuation of attacks in the times of peace, and a continuation and an evolution of how these tools are used in times of war.
Okay, Ido.
Just very briefly, I think that I totally agree with what you just said. It would depend also on the actor and what the actor wants to achieve. So in many cases, cyber attack on average is not discovered until about 200 days past. So if you want to make a statement like a war, you want to make it known that you're attacking. And that's one point. The second point is that if you attach it to a military operation, of course, that's one thing. But if you want to have another effect, for example, you want to have some kind of access to information, to intelligence on the other side, but you want also to have some tools there prepared for some day that you may use them, that's entirely different. So that's a very complicated question, and what we should be very careful about is that cyber security is required all the time. We always tend to think that maybe one day there will be a huge event, a huge cyber event, and they happen all the time, and sometimes they even happen by mistake, not by intention. But cybersecurity is about actually our daily routine. That's where it happens. So it doesn't really matter if it's connected to a specific field or it stands on its own. It doesn't stand on its own. It's always connected either to healthcare or to military or to whatever. And we have to be very careful with trying to connect it to any other specific event. It's there all the time. And this is one of the most complicated aspects of cybersecurity, that you have to be vigilant all the time.
All right. Would anybody amongst the panel wish to add a closing word before we wrap this up? Anything that you'd like to say about anything you haven't had a chance to say? All right. I think it looks like we have exhausted our panel, but it really has been a lively and stimulating discussion. If I was worried before it, I'm more worried now because of the number of issues that clearly don't have a coherent solution yet. But clearly there are people who understand the problem, and many of them are sitting on this podium with me. So I think if understanding a problem is halfway towards solving it, we can at least conclude that we are halfway. Thank you all very much, and good night.